Hello everyone, have a nice day. Today we will explore a deeply emotional chapter in the story of James and Diep. James is hiding in an abandoned house, secretly collecting evidence to bring down his own father, but his heart keeps pulling him back to Diep's small bamboo home at the edge of the village. We'll follow the moment Diep suddenly sees him behind the fence, their tearful embrace, and the warm, simple meal where they finally open up about the dangers ahead. If you find it interesting, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. Diep hit his chest so hard when she reached him that the impact almost knocked the breath out of James. Her arms locked around his neck, fingers twisting into the back of his jacket like she was afraid the wind might tear him away again. Her face was buried against him, warm and wet and shaking. For a second, James just stood there, stunned, as if his mind hadn't caught up with what his body already knew. He was holding her. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Diep was in his arms again. Diep. His voice came out rough, like it belonged to someone who hadn't spoken in days. It's really you. She clung tighter, almost climbing over the low wooden fence to get closer, her shoulders trembling with each shaky breath. "If this is a dream, I'm never waking up," she whispered into his chest. "Do you hear me? Never." The scent of sun, soap, and smoke from the small kitchen fire clung to her hair, cutting straight through the damp, moldy smell of the abandoned house that had lived in his clothes for weeks. James shut his eyes and felt everything hit him at once: the nights on the creaking cot, the dusty files, the flickering phone screen with her smile as his only light. In his mind, the cold room flashed back into focus. Papers spread all over the crooked table, photos of warehouses, copies of contracts no one was supposed to see, numbers that didn't add up unless you knew exactly what kind of crime you were looking at. His own reflection in the cracked phone screen, exhausted, unshaven, eyes red and stubborn, and right behind his mess of files and fear of her picture. Diep in front of this bamboo house, shy smile, bowl of steaming soup in her hands, the wallpaper he never changed, no matter how risky it was. Whenever he stared at that screen too long, something in him twisted so hard it almost drove him back here against his will. Day after day, he'd fought it. He'd told himself, just one more piece of evidence, one more hidden account, one more shipment traced, and then maybe he could stop running. Maybe he could walk into this yard like a man who had something to offer instead of danger clinging to his heels. But his feet never listened. They always brought him back to the narrow dirt road behind the village, to this crooked fence, to the sight of Diep hanging laundry with rolled up sleeves, or sitting on the wooden steps staring at the empty road like it might answer her. Today had been different only because his phone rang. He'd turned away, moved toward the bushes, voice low as his trusted subordinate whispered about suspicious shipments, secret accounts, the kind of files that could burn his father's empire down overnight. James had narrowed his eyes, mind racing, and in that one careless moment, he'd forgotten the most important thing he'd taught himself since he started hiding. Never turn your back on the bamboo house. James, Her voice had floated through the air then, fragile and disbelieving. Now, standing with her held tight against him, he realized he'd never forget the way she'd said his name in that instant half prayer, half accusation, all heart. His phone lay somewhere in the grass, forgotten. James finally lifted his hands properly, wrapping them around her small frame, hugging her so tightly it almost hurt. His chin rested on the top of her head. Her tears slowly soaked through his shirt. Her heartbeat hammered against his ribs like it was trying to wake him up from the nightmare he'd been living. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair. "I'm so sorry, Diep." She pulled back just enough to see his face, her eyes red, lashes wet, nose adorably pink, despite all the pain between them. "You look terrible," she sniffed, trying to glare but failing because her lips wouldn't stop trembling. "You're thinner. Your beard is a disaster. Did you forget mirrors exist?" He let out a small, cracked laugh. "The mirror at the abandoned house did see me, actually. I think it's still traumatizing." Her fingers tightened on his sleeves. "Idiot," she muttered, but her voice broke on the word. "Do you have any idea how scared I've been? Every time someone knocked on the door, every time a motorbike passed by, I thought they were bringing bad news about you." The guilt hit him like a wave. "Diep." He lifted a hand, clumsy and gentle, brushing away the fresh tear sliding down her cheek. "I wanted to come back every single day, but if they followed me, if my father's men even suspected I was near you, this house would be the first place they searched. I couldn't risk it. I can't let you get dragged deeper into his mess." She looked at him for a long moment, breathing unevenly. Then she shook her head, a sad smile hovering at the corner of her lips. "You already did," she said quietly. "The day you walked into my life with that stupid, stubborn face, I was already inside your story. There's no way to stand outside and watch anymore." Her words sank straight into his chest. Before he could answer, she sniffed, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and tugged at his wrist. "Enough," she declared. "I'm not talking to you through a fence like some stranger. Come inside." "Diep, it's not safe." "It's safer than you hiding behind my fence like a scarecrow with a price on his head," she shot back. "If something happens, at least I want to have fed you properly first. Now move." He almost smiled, the old familiar bossiness in her tone wrapped around him like a blanket. She pushed open the small gate and pulled him into the yard. The ground felt painfully familiar beneath his feet, the crunch of dry leaves, the faint smell of soap from freshly washed clothes, the warmth of late afternoon light lying gently over everything. When he stepped across the threshold of the bamboo house, his chest tightened. Nothing had really changed. The low table, the woven mats, the slightly crooked kettle on the small stove. It was still simple, still poor, but to him it felt more real, more honest than the marble floors and crystal lights of his father's mansion. "Sit," Diep said, pointing at the mat like a strict teacher. "You're not leaving until you eat." "Yes, ma'am," he replied softly, and for the first time in months, the word home didn't feel like a lie. She turned away to rinse the rice, sleeves rolled up, moving quickly, but not as steadily as before. Her hands shook a little when she lit the fire. James watched in silence, drinking in every detail like a man who'd been starving for something other than fear. "Can I help?" he asked after a moment. She glanced over her shoulder, eyebrow lifting. "You? Last time you tried to help, you almost burned the rice." "I can at least wash the vegetables," he offered. "I've improved. Hiding alone forces a man to upgrade his skills." Diep hesitated, then handed him a small basket. "Fine, go rinse these, and don't cut your fingers. I don't have enough bandages for your drama." He took the basket and stepped back out into the yard, the fading sunlight brushing his face. For a brief, fragile moment, as water splashed over green leaves in his hands and the sound of crackling fire drifted from inside the house, James let himself feel it fully. He was here, with her, alive. And for the first time in a very long time, the future felt like something more than just running in the dark. The meal they ended up sharing was so simple it almost hurt. A plate of fried eggs, a small dish of fish sauce with chopped chili, a bowl of boiled greens, and a steaming pot of rice. Diep placed everything on the low table and sat down across from him, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "It's not much," she said quietly, "but it's what I've got." James looked at the food, then at her, and felt his throat tighten. "It's everything," he answered. "This is more than I deserve." She frowned, shoving a bowl toward him. "Stop saying that, eat." They started in silence, spoon against bowl, chopsticks clinking softly. Outside, the sky slipped from orange to deep blue, shadows stretching longer across the yard. Inside, the single yellow bulb flickered on, casting a warm circle of light over their little world. Gradually, words began to slip out between bites. James told her in pieces about the warehouses that didn't officially exist, the fake contracts, the hidden accounts, about men who spoke in half sentences and looked over their shoulders too often, about the night he realized his father wasn't just cutting corners, but ruining lives. Diep didn't gasp or interrupt. She just listened, eyes fixed on him, brows drawn together, fingers curled around her bowl as if anchoring herself. "So you really are going to expose him," she said at last, voice low. "I have to," James replied. "If I stay quiet, I'm part of it." She held his gaze. "Then don't stay quiet, but don't shut me out either. I don't want to sit here wondering if you're dead or alive every time the wind changes." He hesitated, the old instinct to protect by disappearing rising up again. Then he pushed it down. "Okay," he said, "no more hiding from you. Whatever I find, whatever happens next, you'll know." Diep exhaled, a small, shaky breath. "Good," she murmured. "If you're going to be brave, then let me be scared beside you. It's better than being scared alone." Later, when the dishes were washed and the night outside felt thick and watchful, James sat by the doorway, looking at the narrow dirt road he'd used for so long as a secret path. "Tomorrow, I'll go back to the abandoned house," he said. "There's still more to do." Diep stepped up beside him, close enough that their shoulders brushed. "Then tonight," she replied softly, "just stay, just for a little while. You've already spent so many nights running. Let this one belong to us." He looked at her, then at the small bamboo house glowing behind them, and nodded. For a few stolen hours, the man hunted by his own bloodline didn't feel like a fugitive. He was simply James, the man who finally got to hold Diep in his arms again, and knew now that letting go would never be an option in his heart, no matter how dark the road ahead became.
Diêm đang trốn trong một căn nhà hoang ở bìa rừng để thu thập bằng chứng lên kế hoạch người cha tham nhũng của mình. Một ngày anh lại phá vỡ quy tắc của mình khi lén về làng theo dõi Diệp từ sau hàng rào cũ, sợ rằng tiết lộ danh tính sẽ khiến cô gặp nguy hiểm. Một buổi chiều khi anh đang nói chuyện điện thoại về bằng chứng quan trọng, Diệp nhìn thấy bóng dáng quen thuộc của anh. Cô chạy đến bên anh gọi tên anh và cuối cùng cả hai cùng ôm nhau trong tuyệt vọng, nước mắt lưng tròng. Diệp kéo anh vào căn nhà tre, nấu cho anh một bữa cơm đơn giản, lắng nghe anh chia sẻ sự thật về cuộc sống của mình. Cô khăng yêu cầu anh đừng xa lánh cô nữa và đòi biết những gì anh phải đối mặt. James hứa sẽ không giấu giếm thêm nữa và cảm thấy bình yên hiếm hoi trong một đêm bị bánh cát bên cạnh cô.